Steil, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I appreciate you having today's hearing. It's focused on today about ensuring free and fair access to the ballot. And I'm glad we're talking about this because Republicans want to ensure that every eligible person who wants to vote is able to cast a vote and that we make sure that every lawful ballot is counted according to state law. I'd be remiss not to point out a bit of irony as we're sitting here today holding an important investigative hearing after the House passed HR-1, a partisan vote in favor, a bipartisan vote in opposition to HR-1. And as many on this committee will recall, no opportunity to mark up or make amendments, to learn from hearings like we could have had today prior to that bill being passed. But alas, here we are during Holy Week on a district work period, joining together to review the importance of making sure that we have it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And as we look back, more Americans are voting than ever before. And I think you noted that in your opening comments that it's great for our republic. In 2020, 158.4 million Americans voted in the presidential election, the highest ever. Wisconsin had record voter turnout in the 2020 election, like many states did. Wisconsin was in the top 5 for voter turnout. And I think it's remiss to not ask the question of ourselves, was this because of a federal mandate? Or was it because states were deciding what works best for them as it relates to voting? Those numbers, I think, will shock some people listening to this because the narrative being pushed, I think, is counter to the idea that we had 158 million Americans vote in the last election. And I think some of the narrative that we're hearing is because we're seeing fewer people voting while we're seeing higher people voting, we have no choice but to federalize our election. The crisis you'll hear is so dire that HR-1 needed to be rushed through the House, again, with only one hearing in this committee, no hearings in others, no amendments allowed to be offered, in particular, no amendments following a major global pandemic that we're more or less still in. No ability to learn our lessons of what happened in the 2020 election to be implemented into this major piece of legislation. So now we're stuck with more of a messaging bill than a real viable piece of legislation that had true bipartisan input. What are some of the problems with HR-1? It guts voter ID protections. For example, in Wisconsin, a state with a strong voter ID law, this bill would allow an individual to vote simply by signing a sworn statement. That's it. It legalizes ballot harvesting at the national level. It'll allow federal funding of congressional campaigns, give government money to fund politicians' reelection efforts, fund negative TV ads. And as we recall, the 800-page bill was rushed through Congress with no consideration of how it would be implemented at the state and local level. As we know here, each state has different election laws because each state is different. Wisconsin has a unique election system. In my home state here in Wisconsin, while voter rolls are centralized, elections are managed by clerks. We have 1,852 local governments overseeing 2,800 polling places and 30,000 poll workers. Very different than some of our other states around the countries. And so laws that govern your right to vote should be made at the level of government closest to the people, not by politicians in Washington, D.C., more focused on appeasing special interest groups, trying to get government money into their reelection efforts. We should be focused on what works for voters. So if there's issues with state laws, we need to work with state legislatures, local officials as to how to change them. That's what I'm doing here in the state of Wisconsin. And so I'm real concerned that the Democrat proposal that was put forward in HR-1 is going to create more distrust in our election process at a time when we need to secure our elections and restore trust in our election system. In a time of real record voting turnout, I don't think it's the time to be mandating a one-size-fits-all to our voting system. And so I look forward to today's discussion and conversation. I do think it's a little bit disappointing we're doing this after we rushed through HR-1, but alas, here we are. And I do look forward to today's discussion. And with that, I yield back. Very much, Chairman. Appreciate the recognition. I'd like to dive in. I was reading a New York Times article the other day on HR-1, and it stated that election administrators have started to raise questions and complaints about the bill. It said, quote, they're simply, they weren't consulted on a major federal rewrite of the system. They believe that has been overseen effectively. One Democratic state elections director said the early voting mandates in the bill would require a county of 2,000 residents to keep polls open for 15 days, 10 hours a day, even for an off-year congressional primary that draws only a handful of voters. And they said such an inflexible requirement, according to this director who spoke on condition of anonymity for fear of repercussions, would create problems, not solve them. Secretary Wyman, you oversee the state of Washington. Were you consulted as Congress passed HR-1 this year?
No, I haven't been.
No, I think that's too bad. But do you agree with the assessment, I guess, of this anonymous source, but it's the New York Times, that there would be real challenges in implementing some of the reforms that were in place in HR-1?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that goes to what I mentioned in my testimony, that it's the prescriptive nature and very specific elements of HR-1 that make it problematic for election officials to be able to implement in the timelines prescribed. For example, I'm trying to find my best one here. I think the VVSG, the voting standards that were set out for the EAC they've just been passed. We don't even have a testing facility that can test to those standards. And the timeline that's presented for the 22 election is going to be problematic. Our state wouldn't have a certified system because if you don't meet the standards and have your systems tested, they're decertified. That's a huge problem nationally.
So I think you and I share a lot of concerns that if HR-1 kind of gets rammed through, not getting the input of states and election officials like yourself, that there could be some real world complications. I really share that concern. Let's dive in a little bit, the state of Washington that you oversee. Can you walk us through, again, a couple of these election integrity measures that you've put in place in your state? And in particular, how you utilize voter ID in the state of Washington to make sure that it's both easy to vote, but also hard to cheat?
Absolutely. Washington State has had voter ID since 2006, and we required at the time of voter registration, they have to provide a Washington State ID card or Washington State driver's license or the last four of their social security number. These are verified, and the vast majority of our applicants provide one of those three. We also have alternate ID. This is one of the key elements of vote by mail elections, which we conduct in Washington State, because we can have a high confidence level that the people that are registered are actual people that have walked into a government agency and proven who they are. And it's separate from voter registration. We also have a statewide voter registration system and election management system that connects our 39 counties in real time. So on election day, they have real time up to the minute information for anyone who walks into a voting center. They can issue a ballot, and if one has already been issued, they can cancel that first one and issue a new one or register a person for the first time. And this is really how we have confidence that we're only counting one ballot no matter how many we've issued to a voter. And finally, we're part of the ERIC project. The nationwide 31 states, I believe, are members right now, and we are able to keep our rolls maintained and also identify potential voters when they move into our respective states and reach out to them and show them how to register and vote.
As you're aware, every state is very different. So in my home state of Wisconsin, we have a little over 1,800 clerks managing the elections at a very local level in our state. My understanding, if my memory serves me correctly, Washington under you is 39 counties, and your elections are held at the county level. Could you just comment briefly some of the challenges of rushing through a major piece of legislation like HR-1 without really reaching out to all of these election officials like yourself that are actually the boots on the ground, kind of technically implementing, that would be forced to technically implement some of these federal mandates if they came through?
The biggest challenge is just the diversity across the country. And again, it goes back to time and money. So even in my state, I have a jurisdiction that has over 1 million registered voters, and I have some that have a few thousand. So to make just a one size fits all issue or mandates is very much an issue for each of those counties. And, we're going to need the resources, and it can't just be one-time money like HAVA was. And then, over time, you have the disparity of counties because some have money and some don't.
Thank you very much. Seeing the time, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, the chair